In a remote village in the English countryside, a break-in and murder took place, with the victim being the wealthiest manor owner in the area. According to the clues left at the scene, the prime suspect is his adopted son, who would inherit the estate upon the manor owner's death. Most notably, the adopted son mysteriously disappeared that night. With these obvious clues, the case should be easy to solve. However, the problem lies in the fact that these clues seem too conspicuous, almost deliberate, raising the question of whether the adopted son is really the culprit. If not, how did the real murderer deceive everyone? Hello, everyone. Today, let's delve into one of Agatha Christie's classic works, The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, featuring the renowned British detective Poirot. Having solved countless cases throughout his career, he grew tired of the city's noise and the constant backstabbing, prompting him to retire to the countryside. That morning, Poirot was invited to visit Roger Ackroyd's factory, as the two were old comrades at arms. Despite having moved there over a year ago, there had been no opportunity to visit until now. Ackroyd, the owner of Fernley Park, was a nouveau riche in the industrial sector, having amassed a fortune through unscrupulous means. However, having no children of his own, he adopted a son to help manage his affairs. Before leaving, Ackroyd mentioned to Poirot to pay attention to the newspaper on Saturday, as it would announce his adopted son's engagement to his niece. After Ackroyd's brother passed away, his sister-in-law and niece had been living there. As everyone was considered family and the two children were not related by blood, Ackroyd had arranged the marriage. Upon learning that his father intended to announce the engagement in the newspaper, the adopted son hastily approached him. He used the excuse of not having found a job yet as a reason to postpone the engagement date, which greatly angered Ackroyd. It had already been delayed by 3 months. What was he really thinking? While they were discussing, Mrs. Ferrars called Ackroyd, extremely distraught, and asked him to come over in the afternoon. A few years ago, Mrs. Ferrars' husband died under mysterious circumstances. Since then, she had been living off his inheritance. Despite being alone, her life was relatively comfortable. One evening, she placed a letter in the mailbox and then went to sleep as usual. Unexpectedly, the next morning, the police received news of Mrs. Ferrars' death. Shepherd, the only doctor in the village, after examining the scene, found that Mrs. Ferrars had taken a large amount of sleeping pills before bed. However, whether she died from an overdose would need to be confirmed by an autopsy. Regarding Mrs. Ferrars' death, Shepherd's sister had a different opinion. People said Mrs. Ferrars had poisoned her own husband, and she must have committed suicide out of remorse. After breakfast, the sister went out to buy groceries. As she passed by the White Hotel, she accidentally overheard the adopted son in conversation with a woman, discussing eagerly how they would come into a fortune once the wealthy old man died, emphasizing the importance of ensuring he doesn't change his will in the meantime. Upon returning home, the sister relayed this incident to Shepherd, noting that the woman was facing away from the window, making it impossible to recognize her identity. However, given that the adopted son was soon to be engaged, it was highly likely that the woman was his fiancée, Flora. Ackroyd had left his entire estate to them, yet this group of greedy individuals seemed to be eagerly awaiting his death. In the evening, Ackroyd mentioned to Poirot an incident concerning Mrs. Ferrars' husband, who was an alcoholic. The coroner stated that he died from an excessive intake of alcohol, which exacerbated his gastritis, ultimately leading to his death. It wasn't until yesterday afternoon, when Mrs. Ferrars invited Ackroyd to her home, that he learned the truth about those years. It turns out that Ackroyd had always been deeply in love with Mrs. Ferrars, who, over time, became moved by him rather than her despicable husband, leading her to poison him. She had lived in agony over the years until she finally broke down and confessed to Ackroyd yesterday. However, what she received in return was not comfort but shock and anger from him. Consequently, Mrs. Ferrars died at her home that night. Initially, Ackroyd believed he had driven her to her death. However, Mrs. Ferrars also revealed another matter. It seemed that someone else was aware of the poisoning and had blackmailed her for a large sum of money. Ackroyd had asked for the name of this person, but Mrs. Ferrars refused to disclose it under any circumstances. Now, it seems worth considering whether Mrs. Ferrars' death could be connected to this mysterious individual. Poirot couldn't help but ponder. Although Ackroyd didn't learn the name of the blackmailer during his visit to Mrs. Ferrars' house, the blackmailer might not think the same. Poirot hoped that Ackroyd would be extra cautious. After dinner, Poirot's unease grew, prompting him to call Ackroyd. The butler, answering the call, informed him that Ackroyd was still at dinner and could only return the call afterwards. Inside the manor, apart from Ackroyd's sister-in-law and his niece Flora, the assistant and Dr. Shepherd were also present at the dinner party, enjoying lively conversations until they all dispersed to rest at 9 p.m. Ackroyd had a habit of having a drink every night, and the butler, as usual, brought the drink to him. However, upon reaching the study's door, the butler saw Flora coming out, who mentioned that her uncle did not wish to be disturbed, prompting the butler to leave. In the dead of night, Dr. Shepherd received a call from the butler, who had just discovered that Ackroyd had been murdered. Shepherd rushed to the scene immediately, but upon his arrival, the butler claimed he had never made such a call. Shepherd was utterly confused, wondering if someone was playing a prank. However, since he was already there, why not check to confirm? The butler pushed the study door, finding it locked from the inside. Ackroyd never had the habit of locking his door, and combined with the strange call just received, Shepherd instantly had a bad feeling. Consequently, he forcibly broke the door lock. The scene that met their eyes was shocking. A dagger was stuck in Ackroyd's neck, and he had stopped breathing. At that moment, Poirot also arrived. Having never received a call back from Ackroyd, he came to check on the situation, only to find that he was a step too late. After the police were alerted, they immediately arrived at the scene. The door was locked from the inside, suggesting the murderer could only have escaped through the window. The chief of police pulled back the curtains and indeed discovered a muddy footprint on the windowsill, indicating that finding the matching shoe might lead to identifying the suspect. The chief then inquired when everyone had last seen Ackroyd. Shepherd stated he left at 9 p.m., and at that time, Ackroyd was still very much alive. The assistant, after thinking for a moment, mentioned wanting to discuss something with Ackroyd around 9:30 p.m. But just as he approached the door, he heard an argument coming from inside, roughly about the frequency of asking for money being too high and the inability to meet those demands. The butler also stepped forward, saying that at 10:10 p.m. he saw Flora leaving Ackroyd's room, even telling him not to disturb Ackroyd. The chief of police asked Flora what she was doing in her uncle's room and if she noticed anything unusual. Flora replied that she was merely saying goodnight to her uncle, which was a normal thing for her to do, and she hadn't noticed anything else out of the ordinary. The next day, Flora approached Poirot, as the police suspected her fiancé, the adopted son who had been residing at the White Hotel, was the murderer. After the crime, he disappeared without taking anything with him, appearing as if he had fled in a panic. Despite his occasional foolish actions, Flora was adamant that her fiancé would never commit murder. She sought Poirot's help to investigate the truth, given his renowned status as a detective. Although Poirot had retired and was initially reluctant to get involved. However, moved by her sincerity, he agreed to speak with the police on her behalf. Upon arriving at the police station, Poirot immediately recognized an old acquaintance, Chief Inspector Japp, with whom he had collaborated many times. Poirot was so excited that he even thought about embracing him. It turned out that the local police force had limited capabilities in handling cases, which is why Chief Inspector Japp was called in. With his old partner by his side, Poirot finally decided to investigate the case. The police's suspicion of the adopted son wasn't unfounded. It was said that the adopted son was in a dire financial situation, and he would inherit the majority of Ackroyd's estate upon his death. Furthermore, the police found a pair of shoes in the hotel where he stayed, the sole pattern of which matched exactly with the footprint left on the windowsill. While evidence is generally a positive development, in Poirot's view, the evidence seemed too perfect. It was as if it was deliberately pointing out that the adopted son was the murderer. Chief Inspector Japp inquired if there had been any other strangers who had recently come into contact with Ackroyd. The butler mentioned that on Wednesday, a salesman had spent a considerable amount of time with Ackroyd, but the assistant interrupted, clarifying that the individual was just selling recording telephones, and Ackroyd had invited him for a demonstration. This had nothing to do with the case. However, when discussing strangers, the assistant recalled seeing a fleeting figure in the garden around 9:30 p.m. the previous night, which, judging by the silhouette, appeared to be a woman. Poirot, known for his meticulous approach to problems, asked the butler if the room's arrangement was the same as on the night of the murder. The butler, very familiar with the room, noticed a difference with just a glance. When the body was discovered, a chair in the corner was pulled out and facing the door, but it had since been returned to its original position. No one would sit in a chair at that angle. Intuition told Poirot that there must be something significant about that chair. Afterwards, the butler remembered something else. That evening, the post office had delivered 5 letters, one of which was a private letter in a dark blue envelope. However, now there were only 4 letters left, and the police had searched the scene without finding that missing letter. It seemed likely that Ackroyd had been killed because of the contents of that letter. At that moment, the police made a new discovery. Dr. Shepherd had received the fake call from the butler at 10:15, and the call had come from a telephone booth outside the village near the train station. A few minutes after the call ended, a train left for Liverpool. Flora had gone to say goodnight to her uncle at 10:10. It seemed impossible for the murderer to kill within 5 minutes and then rush to the train station. Therefore, either the person who made the call knew in advance that Ackroyd was going to die, or Flora was lying. Subsequently, Poirot found a piece of white cloth on a column in the gazebo. The assistant had mentioned seeing a woman flash by in the garden at 9:30 p.m. So the cloth must have been inadvertently left by the woman. But the question remained, what was that woman doing there? That afternoon, Poirot and Chief Inspector Japp visited Ackroyd's private lawyer, wanting to understand how Ackroyd's estate was to be distributed. The lawyer explained that Ackroyd's sister-in-law and niece were each to receive £10,000, with the remaining estate and shares in the factory going entirely to the adopted son, which was a considerable fortune. No matter how one looked at it, the adopted son had a significant motive for the crime. While passing by the river, Poirot was momentarily dazzled by a glint of light from the water. Rolling up his sleeves, he reached into the water and retrieved a wedding ring inscribed with a line of small text. March 13th, from R. Who could this married person, whose name started with an R, be? After returning to the manor, an argument erupted in the room. It appeared that the private lawyer had called, instructing them to account for the cash in the house for inclusion in the estate inventory. However, when the assistant went to retrieve the money from Ackroyd's room, he discovered that £40 were missing. The sister-in-law was convinced that the maid, who had been fired a few days earlier, must have stolen it, wanting to snatch something before she left. The police questioned the maid about her dismissal, and she admitted to having disorganized some documents, which led to her firing in a fit of anger by Ackroyd. While talking to her, Poirot noticed a tear in the maid's apron. It was evident that the cloth he had found in the gazebo came from there. He then asked the maid how long her conversation with Ackroyd was when she was dismissed. She recalled that it lasted about half an hour. Everyone was confused about what the duration of the conversation could imply. That evening, the butler got thoroughly drunk at the pub and then staggered home. When he reached a secluded lane, a car suddenly came out of nowhere and struck him dead. He was just a simple butler. Why would the murderer want to kill him? The next day, Poirot visited the newspaper office and had a private conversation with the editor. The murderer's plan had succeeded, and now Poirot felt he needed to employ some tactics. Afterwards, he and Chief Inspector Japp arranged another meeting with the private lawyer, who, they learned, had handled affairs not only for Ackroyd but also for Mrs. Ferrars. Ackroyd had mentioned that Mrs. Ferrars had been blackmailed. If true, this blackmailer might be connected to the deaths of both Mrs. Ferrars and Ackroyd. Upon reflection, the lawyer remembered that last year, Mrs. Ferrars sold some securities, but the money from the sale wasn't reinvested. Instead, it was transferred into a personal account, a sum of £20,000. It seemed the blackmailer's demands were quite hefty. Back at the manor, Poirot and Chief Inspector Japp approached Flora. Poirot had already noticed something peculiar about the night of the murder. The butler encountered Flora at the door to Ackroyd's study, but being at the door didn't necessarily mean she had come out of it. She could just as well have been trying to go in. Poirot wanted to know what exactly had happened that night. Faced with the unraveling of her lies, Flora couldn't hide her panic. Although she lived in a luxurious house, she was actually in a tight financial situation and even had significant debts. This was why she was eager to marry the adopted son. That night, she indeed had not gone to the study but had stolen £40 from her uncle's bedroom. When she was coming downstairs, the butler coincidentally came to deliver drinks. Flora, unable to hide, pretended to have just come out of the study and falsely claimed that her uncle did not want to be disturbed. Since Flora had not been to the study, this meant that Ackroyd might have already been dead by 10:10 p.m. In the afternoon, Chief Inspector Japp read a shocking piece of news in the newspaper. The adopted son had been arrested in Liverpool. Japp immediately sought confirmation from the Liverpool police, but they knew nothing of it. Poirot smiled, revealing that he had asked the newspaper editor to release this smokescreen, confident that it would soon bring new leads to light. Indeed, as soon as they arrived at the manor, the assistant informed them of something. The maid seemed to be unwell, crying continuously in her room, refusing to come out no matter what he said. This was expected by Poirot, who knocked on her door and then called out a name, Mrs. Patten. Patten was the adopted son's surname, and upon hearing this title, the maid indeed opened the door. It turned out that she had secretly married the adopted son, which was why he kept postponing the wedding with Flora. 2 years earlier, upon her father's death and laden with his debts, the maid had no choice but to work at the manor, where she met the adopted son. They fell in love at first sight and became engaged privately on March 13 the previous year. The ring Poirot found by the river was the one the adopted son had given her. However, without a job and relying only on the maid's small income, the adopted son couldn't clear their debts. Therefore, he attempted to borrow money from Ackroyd, who made the condition that the adopted son marry Flora. Left with no choice, he reluctantly agreed but made his father promise to keep the arrangement secret, as he did not want the maid to find out. Until last Thursday, Ackroyd had completely lost his patience and decided to make the engagement public on Saturday. Left with no choice, the adopted son explained the current predicament to his wife. The maid was so angry that she threw her ring away on her way home. That same afternoon, she confronted Ackroyd. She had expected Ackroyd to be a compassionate person, but to her shock, he accused her of seducing the adopted son for money and, in a fit of anger, fired her. This is why their conversation lasted as long as half an hour. In the evening, the maid called the adopted son to the garden and told him everything that had happened that day. The figure that the assistant saw at 9:30 p.m. was actually the maid. The two of them had a big argument in the garden, and she accidentally tore her apron while leaving. Poirot asked her how long she had talked with her husband that day, and the maid said it was about 10 minutes. She returned to her room at exactly 9:45 p.m. While everyone was talking, Poirot received a call from a sanatorium. Not long before, he had asked Chief Inspector Japp to investigate the staff and patient list of the sanatorium, and now it seemed they had found a clue. He hurried to the sanatorium and found the person he had been searching for in one of the wards. It was time to unveil the mystery. He invited everyone to Ackroyd's office, where the murderer was among the gathered group. Given the time of the incident, Ackroyd was still alive at 9:30 p.m. as the assistant heard him arguing with someone at the door. Since the topic of money was mentioned, many assumed the person inside was the adopted son. However, from 9:30 to 9:40 p.m., the adopted son was in the garden talking with the maid, so the person inside couldn't have been him. Poirot asked the assistant to recall Ackroyd's words during the argument, questioning if there was anything unusual about them. After considering Poirot's analysis, the assistant realized something was off. The tone didn't sound like a conversation but more like a recitation. It dawned on the assistant that this was related to the recording telephone the salesperson had demonstrated to him. The device could record a person's voice, indicating that Ackroyd was not actually talking to someone at that moment but was making a recording. This, however, also confirmed that Ackroyd was alive at 9:30 p.m. Poirot did not elaborate further but shifted the conversation to another topic. After the incident, the adopted son suddenly disappeared. It was possible that he had met with foul play, or perhaps someone was intentionally helping him evade the police. With the hotel being a place of many eyes and ears, only one location offered safety: a private sanatorium. There were 2 sanatoriums in the area, and one indeed admitted a person on Sunday. As he spoke, Poirot opened the door, and the person who walked in was indeed the adopted son. The question now was, who had sent the adopted son to the sanatorium? Dr. Shepherd smiled, and with the adopted son now present, he felt it was no longer appropriate to keep secrets. He admitted to being the one who had arranged for the adopted son to be admitted into the sanatorium. When the adopted son checked into the White Hotel, Shepherd knew something was bound to happen, so he met with him. The adopted son shared everything with Shepherd, including his upcoming marriage and the predicament he found himself in. It was a casual conversation between the two until Ackroyd was murdered. Shepherd's first suspicion fell on the adopted son, so he arranged for him to stay in the sanatorium to lay low for a while. Poirot didn't comment but pulled out a telegram from his pocket, sent from a ship heading to America. Revealing its contents would identify the murderer. However, before unveiling the mystery, Poirot wanted to hear Dr. Shepherd's perspective, considering he was the only doctor in the village and had connections to everyone and everything involved. Seeing that he could no longer avoid the issue, Dr. Shepherd confessed everything he knew. The murderer, having accidentally learned the cause of Mr. Ferrers' death, used this information to establish a financial relationship with Mrs. Ferrers, which Poirot referred to as blackmail. Overwhelmed by the burden, Mrs. Ferrers eventually chose to end her life. However, on the afternoon of her death, she met with Ackroyd. The murderer could not be certain whether Mrs. Ferrers had revealed their identity, and rather than waiting to be caught, decided to act first by eliminating Ackroyd. The murderer's assumption was correct. Mrs. Ferrers initially did not want to disclose the blackmailer's name but soon changed her mind and informed Ackroyd through a letter. The private letter Ackroyd received on the night of the murder was from Mrs. Ferrers. He began reading its contents aloud in front of Shepherd, but when he got to the name of the blackmailer, he stopped. Realizing his secret was exposed, Shepherd then moved behind him and stabbed Ackroyd with a dagger. Indeed, Shepherd was the culprit behind both murders. However, he did not believe he was in the wrong. He argued that Mrs. Ferrers had killed her husband and engaged in adultery, and the money she obtained from Ackroyd was acquired through illicit means. He viewed them as parasites who had no understanding of frugality. Year after year, Shepherd watched as he himself couldn't even afford to travel, while those around him lived lavishly. This bred resentment within him, leading to his decision to eliminate them. Committing murder wasn't as complicated for him. As a doctor, he knew precisely how to kill with a single strike. He then used the adopted son's shoes to leave a footprint on the windowsill, creating the illusion that the adopted son had fled after committing the murder. The next step was making the dead speak. Shepherd rigged a simple timer using a clock to control the recording telephone, which is why the assistant could hear voices in the study at 9:30 p.m. To hide this device, Shepherd moved a chair. After setting everything up, Shepherd went home to wait for a call. The fake call from the butler was actually made by one of Shepherd's patients, who boarded a train to Liverpool right after hanging up. The telegram Poirot received was likely sent by this patient. Upon arriving at the scene, Shepherd instructed the butler to call the police. During this time, he retrieved the timer and the recording device and returned the chair to its original position. Lastly, Shepherd approached the adopted son, claiming his situation was dire, and arranged for him to stay in the sanatorium. As for killing the butler, it was because he was too observant. He knew about the private letter sent that night and noticed the chair had been moved. It wouldn't have taken him long to figure out who the murderer was. Shepherd didn't want to take any risks, so he chose to run him over with his car. With the truth unveiled, Shepherd's sister, seeking to create an opportunity for him to escape, deliberately revealed a handgun from her bag. Shepherd instantly understood her intentions, grabbed the handgun, and rushed out. Chief Inspector Japp, of course, could not let him escape and quickly followed. The revolver had only 6 bullets, and when Shepherd missed his target with the first 5 shots, he knew there was no escape. Preferring to control his own fate rather than face execution, he used the last bullet to end his own life. In the end, Poirot sealed away Shepherd's diary. He had thought that moving to the countryside would allow him to escape the evils of the city. Little did he know, the real evil was not the noise and chaos of urban life, but the darkness and sin lurking within the human heart. And with that, the story comes to a close. The Murder of Roger Ackroyd is indeed one of Agatha Christie's most classic works, and it has even surpassed the famous 10 Little Niggers in fan polls. The novel is uniquely narrated in the first person by Dr. Shepherd, who is cautious and conservative in his actions. This narrative perspective allows readers to uncover clues gradually, solely through his viewpoint, making the twist ending particularly shocking and innovative for its time. Christie's use of the narrator as the murderer was groundbreaking, challenging traditional mystery conventions and solidifying her reputation as a master of the detective story genre. The charm of Agatha Christie's novels lies in their ability to continuously lead audiences into guessing and speculating. Unlike films that often offer an omniscient perspective, novels limit the viewpoint to the characters within the story, magnifying the allure of deduction and making the reading experience both exhausting and exhilarating. Human nature is an inescapable theme in Christie's works, where every character harbors their own ulterior motives. The assistant, controlling the factory alone, stands to gain more power with Ackroyd's death. The butler, after serving in the manor for 6 years, contemplates exposing Ackroyd's secrets upon learning he's been left nothing in the will. The sister-in-law and Flora, while outwardly noble, are parasites living off Ackroyd's wealth and wishing for his early demise. Mrs. Ferrers murders her husband to be with her lover, and Ackroyd, professing love for Mrs. Ferrers, callously abandons her upon discovering she is a murderer. Dr. Shepherd, portraying his blackmail as justice and his murder as a divine act, is not ignorant of evil but simply afraid to confront the darkness within himself. In the end, Poirot, filled with sentiment, grows tired of the city's wickedness and intrigue, opting for a tranquil life in the countryside. Here, amidst the serene green fields and gentle bird songs, where everyone's face wears a kindly smile, lies a hidden truth he's unaware of. Beneath the verdant fields rest horrifying secrets, and the kindly smiles are merely masks. As Poirot suggests, everyone harbors some flaw deep within. For some, it never surfaces, allowing them to lead dignified lives, while others release it, letting evil consume them. Life is about choices, and only by maintaining a balanced perspective can one find the correct answers in each decision. Thank you for joining me in today's story. If you enjoyed my narration, remember to like and support. Your encouragement is my greatest motivation.